Hello crafty friends, it's Jess from jesscrafts.com, and today I have a card for the Butterfly Reflections ink blog. I will be using some watercolor with distressed reinkers today. And the Butterfly Reflections ink shop, they now have a lot of the reinkers, especially for the new colors, but also for some of the old colors. And I took some Tim Holtz Distress watercolor paper and cut it out with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die. I'm going to start by laying on some color with a clean, wet paintbrush. And in between colors, I will be cleaning my water because I'm going to be using a lot of strong colors, and you're going to want to have just clear water each time to start this technique. By laying the water down first, it allows the reinkers to react with the water and create a really sort of natural flowing look, and that's what I was looking for. I've really been admiring other people's watercolor cards where it doesn't look very controlled and it looks like they're basically letting the watercolor react more with the natural flow of the water, and so that's something that I was experimenting with on today's card. I feel like I had some varying degrees of success with it because it's something that I was trying for the first time. And so for instance here, I put a lot of reinker on and it was probably too much and would have been difficult to dry. And so I did problem solve that by I'll be bringing in a second piece of cardstock to transfer over some of that color, and I'll wind up creating two panels at once. But when the reinker was laid on, it started reacting and it created some darker spots and some lighter spots, and that's definitely part of what I wanted. I wanted there to be interest and variation of color and kind of let the watercolor do a little bit more of its own thing. But it did not spread all over the area that I had painted, so I'm helping it along by dipping my brush in the water, and I'm trying to make sure that my brush is pretty wet so that there'll be a lot of water put down on the paper and the ink will be allowed to sort of do what it would naturally do, as opposed to being too controlled by my paintbrush. And so if your brush was a little bit less, was more a little more dry, you get a more controlled look, you get more of a dry brush look and not so much of this flowing color. And also you can see that the the color stops where the water stops. And so any area of the paper that's still dry, this water won't, the paint won't shift to unless I were to completely turn the paper on its side, let gravity do its thing and pull it right off. But as long as you keep it relatively flat, it stays in the area defined by the water that you lay down initially. And so like I said, I think I had a little too much paint on there for it to dry reasonably, and I think that those darker areas on the side would have just would not have looked good. So I decided to transfer over some of the paint well, it's not quite paint, but what looks like paint in this case, some of this color over to a second card just by pushing the second card panel onto the first. But it's important not to put too much pressure, or that's going to cause the ink on both panels to spread, and you'll lose that controlled look that you had created, that shape of the color on the first card. So just gently touch them together, transfer over a little color, and then I used a wet paintbrush. I'm always in this technique trying to keep my brush nice and wet, and I picked up some color, placed it over to the other card, added some extra water, and kind of started letting it do its flowing thing over there as well. In between each color, I dried it completely. And this was partly because I wanted to make sure the colors stayed really dark and vibrant. But when I decided that I wanted to have a little bit of blending in between each, that might have not been the ideal situation, because once it's dry, it still will react with water but won't blend as much. So that's kind of an artistic choice you'll want to make. Decide how much do you want the two colors to blend together, or how much do you want them to be separate. In the end, I was pretty happy with how mine turned out because I was looking more for a separated look, and so I was able to achieve enough blending for the look I wanted, but it depends on, again, what you're going for. The colors that I'm using today are Mermaid Lagoon, Abandoned Coral, and Fossilized Amber, which are three of the new colors of Distress ink. And what's really awesome is that Vanessa has been really great about getting all these colors ASAP in all the different variations. So you get the shop, you can get them with the markers or the reinkers or the pads. And so if you are as hooked on the new Distress colors as I am, Butterfly Reflections ink is a great source for them. Now, once the red starts touching the blue, the water starts reacting and pulling the blue color down into the red. And that's not really what I was looking for. So you see I just took a clean paper towel and sopped up that streak of purple. And as long as you notice those pretty quickly, you can go in there and pull that color out. And I'd wanted to create a little bit of blending between the colors, so you'll see that I add some water after these two are laid on there and start making a little bit more of a clear blend, because right now the line between the blue and the abandoned coral is really harsh, and I decided I don't like that look. But when I was playing around with the color, I got a little drip of the abandoned coral, the reddish color, onto the side there. And that was pretty disappointing, but I knew I needed to just work with it, and this was supposed to be a sort of messy technique anyway, and so I just intentionally added some drops of the abandoned coral to the other side, and I'll go back and add some blue drops later to the top just to make it look like I intentionally had drops everywhere, even though that wasn't what actually happened, and it was just an accident. But, you know, when you are creating cards and art, you let those accidents either work for you, find out a way to cover them up. That's part of the fun here. So I just figured I would share with you one thing that I did, and I actually do another sort of cover up of a mistake later on as well. Now, I thought that it would be fun to do a really primary card, like a red, white, and, a red, blue, and yellow, the primary colors, not American colors, red, blue, and yellow. And so, since I was using the other new colors of Distress ink, I also went with the fossilized amber. But when I put it on, it looked really brown, especially because I've been using these 3 drops. And I knew I wanted to pull that color back a little bit and get to more of the yellow that was involved in it. So I'm pulling a lot of that color off and transferring it over to the other piece of paper, the other panel that I'm creating. But I also just pulled some of it off with like a napkin by touching my paint, my water brush to the paint, and then dabbing it off on a napkin off to the side that you can't see, just to lighten that color a little bit, because I wasn't quite going for as dark of a yellow as it turned out to be. And you see there I just took a paper napkin and laid it right over to sop up a good amount of that color. So you definitely want to think about the fact that these colors will be a little bit more intense when you're using them as a re-inker, because the re-inker is a very concentrated form of the distress color. Once I had those watercolor panels the way that I liked them, I decided to go with this elephant from Avriel's Ellie stamp set. I've had this elephant for a long time, and I just never got around to using him, and I really wanted to make a point to use him today. So I stamped down 3 of them because I have the 2 card bases, and I was going to begin again experimenting with this re-inker coloring on the elephants, and I wasn't sure how it would turn out, so I figured it was a good idea to do 3 of them and then pick my 2 favorite elephants. So I started again by laying on some color with a clean brush, and I've been changing my water in between colors, as I mentioned before, because you don't want these colors to mix in. I had a little bit of blue paint there at the start left in my brush, but luckily I was able to clean it out pretty easily, and the blue wasn't too much of a contrast to the gray, like they didn't mix in a bad way. So I laid the water down, then I put a little bit of the re-inker right onto the elephant. But I felt like that had created too dark of a color and soaked the elephant a little bit too much. So I decided instead to put a drop of re-inker onto my Ranger craft sheet and pick it up and like lay it down into the elephant instead. And what I'm doing is laying the color into the areas that should be darkest to create a shadow effect. Just like I would do if I was coloring with Copics, where the lines meet and there's wrinkles in his skin or something, or the 2 legs coming together, they should be darker. So I'm taking the re-inker and dropping it in there and then letting it react with the water to create a similar effect. I'm going to be eventually fussy cutting out the elephants and adhering them to the panel, but I wanted to stamp down the elephant where I would be placing him as a placeholder first, because I wanted to do something with this abstract stencil from MFT. I wasn't quite sure at first how I was going to use it. I just really thought that the abstract stencil would look fun with this cool painted background. And I wanted to really just keep going with that artsy effect. And so I decided that it would be kind of fun if the triangles were coming out from the elephant's trunk, like essentially like he was blowing bubbles, but he was blowing triangles. And it's like obviously all very silly and doesn't make any sense, but this is just kind of a very like artsy, playful sort of card. So you'll just have to go with it. And I decided to trace them with my Pitt Artist pen because that is waterproof. And I didn't know for sure at this point if I would be adding any more water elements to the card, so I thought it would be better to just use a waterproof ink. And I am choosing which of the triangles I want based off of trying to create a pattern where there's a single triangle coming right out from his trunk, and then the pattern will be getting wider as it goes towards the end. And you see there that I kind of lift up the stencil partway in between to see if I like it. Now, this Tim Holtz watercolor paper does have some roughness to it, and so my lines were not perfectly straight or complete, and I decided again to just roll with it, to make it work for me, to kind of continue with that artsy look. And so then I just hand drew over all the triangles, and it created these really rough, sketchy triangles that I really liked. I was happy with how it turned out. It was kind of this whole card was just a very much an experimentation, like, let me see if this is going to work. I'll try this technique, I'll try that technique, and just see how it goes. And so as I'm tracing over these, the pen is catching on some of the tooth of the cardstock, and so I'm getting these random lines, a little jumpy into them. But again, this is supposed to be creating a really hand-drawn effect. So, you know, if you're not really sure about your artistic abilities, or these sort of mixed media sort of things scare you, I would just encourage you to go for it, because worst case scenario, you've wasted one piece of cardstock. But if you kind of just keep rolling with it and letting the art sort of tell you what it wants to do, you might wind up with something you really like. I decided to stamp the sentiments right inside these triangles because this stamp set included this little tiny high, which some of the triangles were big enough for, and so then I wouldn't be distracting from the elephant or this stencil design by adding the sentiment somewhere else, and it would all stay really cohesive. So I fussy cut out the elephant, and I traced him as usual with my Memento marker. And then the tail, I didn't want to bother fussy cutting it, so I just colored it in solid black, again with that Pitt Artist pen. And I'm going to be using some multi-medium to adhere the elephant on. I did a second card with the second panel, but this video is already getting a little bit long, so I decided not to show that one. And in that one, when I was in the drying process, I accidentally pulled off a little bit of the watercolor paper. And going with my theme of just make it work, I repositioned my elephant to cover the little bit of ripped color in the cardstock, and instead took the triangles and sort of spun them around the elephant. And I'll show you that card here at the end as well. So I'll adhere it to a black card panel mat and then onto a white card base, and that's it for my card today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're interested in more crafting tutorials, you can subscribe to my channel or also to the Butterfly Reflections Ink channel. I will leave a link to the Butterfly Reflections Ink shop in the video description below. Thanks for watching. Bye.